Hey, what's up guys? I'm BTC. Overwatch is now 3 years old, and today we're gonna take a look at all the abilities that have been removed from the game and some that never made it past the testing phase. Since Overwatch was released, there have been more than a few character reworks that removed, replaced, or redesigned abilities. I'm going to show you each of these abilities and explain a little bit of why they got replaced, and then at the end of the video I have a bonus treat for you, a little something extra special, a couple of abilities that were originally planned for the characters and even tested on Blizzard's internal servers, but never actually made it into the full game. Let's get started. This first one is one of the more well-known changes, and that is Bastion Shield. When this character was first introduced, Bastion had a shield in Sentry mode, but there was a limitation that the character could not turn all the way around as you can now. Instead, you were locked in that frontal 180 degrees, and if you wanted to look behind you, you had to switch out of Sentry mode, turn around, and then go back into Sentry mode. This made it so that the best strategy for Bastion was to always put yourself against the wall or into a corner so that no one could get behind you. So Blizzard decided to remove the barrier altogether and make it so that Sentry mode could spin all the way around 360. But they added an extra vulnerability of the critical box that's on the back of the Bastion in Sentry mode. More recently, Hanzo had a change to his main damaging ability. Originally, it was called Ricochet Shot, and then it was changed to Scatter Arrow when it was released in the full game. This attack did tremendous amounts of damage to an enemy. When done right, you could one-shot many of them. A few problems though, as it wasn't really a steady form of damage. Instead, it was more extreme burst damage that was often frustrating to deal with. Another issue was that you had to aim at the ground in front of your enemy as opposed to aiming at the enemy itself. Blizzard decided to replace this with the Storm Arrow. This changed Hanzo's damage from being more burst to a little more steady and reliable. However, pieces of Scatter Arrow can still be found in the Dragon's animation and on one of Hanzo's highlight intros. One of the biggest game-changing alterations was made to Mercy. Her original ultimate was a mass res for the entire team. Early Overwatch players will remember the excitement of being able to use a team-wiping ultimate that seemingly won the fight, only for the enemy Mercy to swoop in and res the entire enemy team, thus starting the fight all over again. At first glance, this may seem like a very powerful ability, but in reality, it wasn't really. The mass res was essentially a reset the fight option, as opposed to just outright winning it like other support ultimates could do. There was also an issue with a particular playstyle that arose from this. While many higher skill Mercy players would use the ultimate as a tempo res, just getting 1 or 2 players back, less experienced Mercy players would resort to something called hide and res, where they would deliberately run away from the fight, not participate, not heal their teammates, and wait for their team to die, and then swoop in and try to res them. Mercy would get a new ultimate called Valkyrie, and the Mass Resurrect was moved to a normal ability and instead was a single target res. That while eventually this would get nerfed, it would initially make Mercy the single most powerful and must-pick character the game has ever seen. Often she had a 97% pick rate. The little red health orbs. Today, these are just a spray that Reaper has, and many new players may think that it was just something that looked cool and have no idea what it was originally used for. But before Reaper had a direct lifesteal passive, he would regain health by picking up these little red soul orbs that were dropped by players when they died. While this was useful for refilling Reaper's health as the fights came to a close, it was nearly useless at the start or the middle of a fight. The problem, of course, was that you couldn't gain any health until the enemy was dead, and until that happened, Reaper's passive had no benefit. So Blizzard decided to change this to a direct lifesteal where any damage he deals is now returned as health for Reaper, and those little red soul orbs now begin to disappear as a fading memory. Torbjorn's rework wasn't all that long ago, but even before that, he had other major changes to the character, removing or significantly altering some abilities. The first thing was that he needed to collect scrap during the match. This was dropped by dead players, and this scrap could be used to upgrade your turret or to create and distribute armor packs to your team. Later it would be changed so that the scrap was not required to build and repair your turrets, but only to create those armor packs. You were also generating scrap over time in addition to collecting the scrap off the ground. But with his rework, the scrap was removed entirely, and so were the armor packs. Torbjorn was heavily inspired by the engineer from Team Fortress 2, and this scrap collecting mechanism was a holdover from that. And while it works in TF2, it just didn't really turn out to be a good fit for Overwatch. But there's more for Torbjorn. Let's look at his turret. There have been quite a few changes to it throughout the years. Initially, it started as almost an exact copy of the engineer turret from TF2. The level 1 of the turret would build itself, but to get to level 2, Torbjorn had to upgrade it, and this required him to hit it with his forge hammer, and he needed scrap. You could then continue building it to level 3 in the same manner. This meant that Torbjorn spent a great deal of time building and upgrading the turret. This made it extremely valuable as it was a significant cost in both time and resources. It also meant that Torbjorn spent more time hitting the turret with his hammer than trying to actually attack the enemy. The original level 3 turret had missiles for extra damage and 600 health. For new and inexperienced players, that level 3 turret was extremely difficult to deal with. Later, the turret would be changed so that you could no longer build it to level 3 normally. Instead, level 3 for the turret was included as part of Torbjorn's ultimate Molten Core. When the Molten Core ability expired, the turret would then return back down to a level 2. The turret was changed again in Torbjorn's major rework. Now it's impossible to get the turret to level 3, and it would build itself to level 2 automatically. However, level 3 turrets still exist in the game in a variety of sprays and highlight intros. Lastly for Torbjorn is his old ultimate Molten Core. It's been replaced with a completely different ultimate that still uses the same name, and the old Molten Core was switched to a regular ability and renamed Overload. But because it's a regular ability, it's significantly weaker than the old version of Molten Core. Also, the old version of Molten Core provided more than just the armor and the speed boost. It also substantially buffed the turret, and it gave Torbjorn an infinite amount of scrap for the duration. There's also another ability that Torbjorn used to have that never made it out of the testing phase, and I'll cover that at the end of the video, but first we have to talk about the character that has probably had the most changes of any hero in the game, and that's Symetra. Every single attack and ability for Symetra has been changed. Other than the appearance of the hero, nothing is the same as when she was first released. Let's go through the list. We'll start with her primary and secondary attacks. Unlike other false lock-ons that are only visually locking on like Moira or Winston, Symetra had the only true lock-on attack that's ever been in the game. This attack would automatically attach to the closest target and stay locked on as long as they were in range. Because it was an actual lock-on ability, it had a little bit of a give to it, allowing the attack to stay attached even when the enemy went around a corner. As expected, some players would find this extremely frustrating to deal with. This has since been replaced with a beam that functions a lot more like what Zarya has. Symetra's alternate attack could originally pass through barriers and enemies, allowing it to hit as many players as were in the way. This type of attack is known as a piercing attack, and Reinhardt's Fire Strike functions in the same way. This was later changed so that the orb would no longer have the piercing effect and would instead detonate on impact and deal damage in an area of effect. That stuff was changed not all that long ago, but let's go way back. Very few people will remember Symetra version 1.0 and the Photon Shield. This was an ability that would semi-permanently grant additional shields to your teammates. Targeting your teammate would apply this effect, and it would last until they died, at which point you would have to reapply a new Photon Shield to them, but as long as they didn't die, they would keep it until the end of the match. Initially, it provided 50 shields, and at the time, you could have more than one of the same hero on a team, and this allowed for something called shield stacking. The Photon Shield would later be replaced with something known as the Photon Barrier, not to be confused with the new ultimate of the same name. This was a barrier shield that was launched in front of Symetra. While this ability did have its uses, they were a bit limited because of the speed that the barrier moved through the air. It meant that it was only blocking damage for a very small amount of time before it was very quickly out of position. Symetra's mini-sentries also deserve a mention, as they've gone through some changes, even though their main function still remains the same. The big difference is that originally these turrets had to be placed on a surface up close. Symetra had to be right next to the wall or the floor in order to do it, whereas now they've been changed so that they can be launched through the air and land wherever Symetra is pointing at. Getting back to bigger changes, Symetra's original ultimate was the teleporter. You would place the exit portal anywhere in the map, and then the entrance would be automatically created in the spawn room. This was a one-way trip and did not require the player to activate the teleporter. Simply stepping on it would take you through the entrance and to the exit. In the Symetra 2.0 rework, in addition to the teleporter, she was given a second ultimate called the Shield Generator. You activate the ultimate, and then pressing the ultimate button again would cause you to cycle through the teleporter and the shield generator, allowing you to choose whichever one you wanted to use. The teleporter still functioned the same as it had before, but the shield generator would now provide 75 shield to all teammates within a very large area surrounding the shield generator. Unlike the Photon Shield ability, the shield gain from the generator was temporary. As long as the player was inside the area, they would still have the shield, but if they left the area, then the shield would go away. The shield generator itself could also be destroyed, removing the shields entirely. Both of these, however, would be replaced in Symetra 3.0 with a new version of the Photon Barrier that created a massive wall of shielding throughout the entire map. The teleporter was then changed to a normal ability that now functioned as a two-way gate that players would have to interact with in order to use. Alright, so those are the abilities that made it into the full retail version of the game and have since been removed, but what about the abilities that some characters had that never made it out of the testing phase? Certainly there are going to be quite a few that we may never know about, but Blizzard has shared with us at least a few of them. This first ability wasn't removed entirely, but it did have a pretty major change during the development phase, and that's Farris' Concussive Blast. Originally, it did massive damage to enemy barriers, but that function was removed because Blizzard felt that it was so strong that it would have been a required pick for your team. Another cool ability was Genji's Wall Cling. Rather than climbing up the wall as we have it now with Genji, the original version allowed him to stick to the wall, kinda like Spider-Man. However, this was at a time when Genji used his sword as his primary weapon, all the time. However, we did get this wall cling ability again later on from the Talon Assassin enemies that appeared during the Archive event missions. Another ability that never made it out of the testing phase was Bastion's original ultimate, Volley. Rather than switching into the tank form we have now, the original idea was for Bastion to launch a series of bouncing grenades into an area. Imagine an entire team of Junkrats spamming into one spot. That's pretty much what it would have been. One of the original designs for Torbjorn was to give him this really interesting claw ability. Torbjorn would launch a device towards a wall, and it would wait there as a trap. Whenever the enemy went by it, it would launch out, grab the enemy, and prevent them from moving away from it. Now, it didn't stun them or lock them in place. Instead, it acted more like a tether to that location, kind of like what Hammond does with his grapple when it's locked onto a wall. While we don't have much information on this ability, it does appear that it was a single-use ability similar to Junkrat's Steel Trap. And speaking of Hammond, his original design was far different from what we ended up getting. Rather than flying through the air, he was going to stay on the ground a lot more. One of his abilities would have allowed him to spin up and roll towards the enemy, kinda like a bowling ball. Also, his primary attack was going to be a double set of flamethrowers. And then we have Doomfist and his rock-throwing ability. Video of this was never officially released by Blizzard, although there is some very low-quality footage of this that does exist. How it worked was that Doomfist would reach into the ground, pull out a chunk of rock, and then throw it at the enemy. Now, this might sound a little familiar for those of you that played Left 4 Dead. There's a special enemy in that game called a tank, and it would do effectively the same thing. It would reach into the ground, pull out a chunk of rock, and throw it at someone. If you're playing in the versus mode of that game, you could even play as the tank and do that ability yourself. While this ability never made it into the final version of Doomfist, it does seem that Blizzard gave a little bit of a callback to it when they added the crushing emote for one of the Lunar New Year events. Now, it's entirely possible that Blizzard could add some of these abilities back into the game on a new character, or possibly just as a custom mode in the workshop. But for now, they're gone. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more, subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss anything. Also, come hang out in my Discord server and my Twitch live stream. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to see what kind of cool VIP rewards you can get, check the links down below. And remember, always blame the controller, because it's never your fault.